Hello, race fans. My name is Dan Selby, and today we're going to be discussing the prospect of Formula One racing behind closed doors. Now, discussions don't tend to work too well on your own, so I am joined by Keith Collantine. Keith, how is it going? I hope you are keeping safe.
Yeah, I'm keeping very safe, thank you. I think, like all our readers and viewers, I'm very, very keen to see the motor racing season get going again. And as you say, one topic that's being looked at not just in Formula One but in other championships as well is whether when we do get racing going again, we're going to have to do it without spectators, which yeah, obviously seems like a little bit of a radical idea, but it might be something that they have to consider. Obviously, as we all know, we're all trying to practice social distancing at the moment. Here in Britain, we're effectively under lockdown where we're not really allowed to leave our houses unless it's for essential stuff. And that means that, I think we're not going to be in a situation where we go from that into tomorrow being able to have, 100,000 people at Silverstone and all the thousands of people that you need to put on a race. So this is something that it looks like they're going to have to consider. But the question becomes whether it's a practical idea or not.
Yeah, I mean, there's many questions with regards to this subject. I mean, it's certainly not just Formula One that's contemplating this idea. We've also seen the Australian supercars mull over this concept as well. But I suppose one of the biggest questions is, Keith, in your opinion, do you think this idea could actually work? Do you think it could be executed?
I think there's a couple of drawbacks. I mean, obviously, not having all the fans there, it does solve one problem from the point of view of the pandemic, but you would lose the atmosphere, and from a more practical point of view, you'd lose the income because you couldn't charge fans, the hundreds and hundreds of pounds it costs to go to a race, and then not allow them in. So the circuits there would lose millions. That would have to be made up some way, and you'd have to say it would be down to Formula One's owners, that would be Liberty Media, whether they want to step in and fill in that gap. And then there's also other practical considerations as well. I mean, even if you take the fans out of the equation, which is by far the largest group of people at the track, you've then got all the people in the paddock as well. And if you look at the rules, for instance, Formula One teams are allowed to bring in at least, at most 60 people who are concerned with the operation of the car, but then they also have other people as well, marketing, press, PR, sponsorship, the sponsors that they bring in, and so on, that are also playing an important role there. And it becomes a question of looking through all this and asking how many of these people are essential. How do we pare back the paddock to the bare minimum to make it reasonable that at some point when we've de-escalated the restrictions that we have in place, holding a Formula One race in this reduced form might become a reasonable thing to do, because I think that could become realistic sometime before it becomes realistic to having the full show back.
So, I mean, other championships had considered this method early on, Keith, but they essentially decided not to go through with it. Do you think that's an indictment on how feasible this idea actually is?
You could look at it that way, but I think you'd have to look at it also from a practical point of view. I mean, you mean Formula One considered doing this for the Bahrain Grand Prix. The Bahrain promoters announced that was going to happen, but then that race was called off. NASCAR looked to doing the same thing, and IndyCar with its season opener at St. Petersburg. Again, they had all the cars out there, they had the fans ready to come, and then very shortly before activities were supposed to begin, they said, okay, we're going to have to run it behind closed doors. And then not too long after that, they did then go and call the whole thing off. I think those examples are really a case of those championships being overtaken by circumstances. The rate at which this spread caught an awful lot of people by surprise. It wasn't just the case, Formula One with the Australian Grand Prix. Obviously, what happened there was very unfortunate. But, other championships have seen this developing quickly as well. But I think, again, if you look at the total number of people that come to races, particularly in the case of Formula One, where we get these enormous six-figure crowds, it might well be something they have to look at. But it is going to have big practical considerations, and it is going to bring big costs. It's not going to be a panacea. It's going to require a compromise.
With regards to the tracks themselves, Silverstone probably being a prime example, they almost at best break even with the Grand Prix when it comes to their expenditure and how much they receive back from the spectators. How viable is this going to be to some of those circuits? Is it going to be a case of someone like a Silverstone, for example, flat out has to say, no, that under any circumstance we cannot do this? Or what kind of middle ground do you think there's going to be, Keith?
I think you're definitely right to point out that the circumstances vary enormously from venue to venue, country to country, track to track. There are tracks and countries where we know where the governments subsidise their races to the tune of tens of millions of pounds, and perhaps in those cases the additional expense of running it without a crowd may not be so great a concern, particularly when you consider that the crowds at some races are more in the region of sort of 25, 30,000 people compared to the capacity 100,000 plus you get at Silverstone or Mexico or somewhere like that. So yes, I think in those cases, maybe the question becomes not straightforward, but perhaps an easy one to answer. But for somewhere like Silverstone, for instance, which doesn't have that kind of government support, again, it would be much more difficult, I would imagine.
The key question, at least I'm putting to you, is do you think this will happen?
Honestly, at the moment, it's hard to say, but you got to say the economic pressures to get everything up and running again. The economy far beyond motorsport has obviously slowed down to a near standstill. The pressures to get things up and running again and to resume some kind of normal life are going to be phenomenal. There's an enormous amount of money riding on whether Liberty Media can pull off the full season, not just a full season in terms of whether it counts for a legitimate championship, and they need a minimum of 8 races for that, but also in order to meet the terms of their broadcasting contracts. And as we understand, there's some variation in terms of the number of races they need to do to hit that target. So they're going to be under really big pressure to do this. It would be absolutely extraordinary to hold one or more races, without any fans present, or deliberately preventing fans from turning up. But these are absolutely extraordinary times. And so at some level, I'm sure this discussion is going to be had, and they're going to assess whether or not it's realistic. And at that point, it's going to be really unpleasant for the fans who bought tickets for those races. And I talked to some of the fans who had bought tickets for Bahrain, and for a while, it looked as though that race was going to go ahead without them. It's going to be, really, really unfortunate for them as well. There's going to be a lot of fans this year who are going to be disappointed in that respect, because we've already had 8 races cancelled or postponed. So I do think it's something they're going to look at, but as with so many things in Formula One and life and politics, whether it actually happens or not, that comes down to the financial decisions at play and the people in the room. But anyway, we've had a close look at this on racefans.net. We've got a new analysis up today from Dieter Rencken, who's been speaking to the key players in and around this issue and looking into the fine detail of how many people, could you cut the Formula One paddock down to the bare minimum in order to get this done, and what would be the economic implications of it, because those are the factors that are going to determine whether this is possible or not.
Thanks very much for your time, Keith. In conclusion, I think watch this space. Keep up to date on racefans.net, and please do make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. So thanks very much once again for listening, and we'll speak to you again very soon.